A pregnant German shepherd was suffering alone in a flooded warehouse. But what a baby did after entering that dark place saved more than one life and moved everyone around. Subscribe now and see how this little hero changed everything. It was a dark summer afternoon in the forgotten outskirts of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The sky, once clear blue, had turned an ominous gray, and the first heavy raindrops began to fall. Sarah Miller hurried along the cracked sidewalk, pushing a makeshift grocery cart filled with fruits and supplies she'd just purchased at the corner market. Her 18-month-old son, Ethan, was securely fastened to her chest in a cloth carrier, babbling happily despite the worsening weather. The abandoned factories and warehouses around them stood as silent reminders of Millbrook's more prosperous past, when steel production had brought life and wealth to the town. Now weeds grew through cracks in the concrete, and rusted chain-link fences surrounded decaying buildings that once housed hundreds of workers. Sarah had never planned to end up here. Just 2 years ago, she had been finishing her nursing degree, with dreams of working at a prestigious hospital in Philadelphia. Then she'd met James, fallen in love too quickly, and discovered she was pregnant. James had disappeared by the time Ethan was born, leaving Sarah to drop out of school and move to the only place she could afford, her grandmother's old house in Millbrook's industrial district. "Almost home, sweetie," Sarah whispered to Ethan as the rain began to fall harder. She quickened her pace, knowing they were still several blocks from the small, peeling blue house that had become their shelter. Suddenly, Ethan stopped his babbling. His tiny body stiffened in the carrier, his head turning sharply toward a massive, abandoned warehouse across the street. An old sign, barely legible through years of rust and grime, identified it as Millbrook Iron Works, Eastern, 1923. Bah, Ethan said, pointing insistently at the building. Sarah ignored him at first, more concerned with getting out of the rain. But Ethan's noises became more urgent, evolving into short, staccato sounds that eerily resembled a dog's bark. "What is it, Ethan?" Sarah asked, confused by her son's sudden fixation. She'd never seen him act this way before. His tiny body twisted in the carrier, his arms still extended toward the warehouse, his face growing red with effort. Okay, Sarah said, adjusting her direction to approach the rusted gate of the warehouse. "But just for a minute, then we really need to get home." The gate yielded with a long, protesting creak. Inside, the cavernous space was dark and partially flooded from a leaking roof. Puddles reflected what little light filtered through the broken windows. The air smelled of rust, mildew, and something else, something animal. "See? Nothing here," Sarah said, preparing to turn around. But Ethan let out a sharp cry, so sudden and piercing that Sarah jumped. The sound echoed through the empty warehouse, bouncing off concrete pillars and metal rafters. "Ethan, what's gotten into you?" Sarah asked, growing worried. She'd never heard him make such a sound before. From deep within the warehouse came a weak, answering whimper. Sarah froze, straining her eyes to see through the shadows. "Hello?" she called, her voice small in the vast space. "Is someone there?" No human voice answered, but another whimper, slightly stronger, reached her ears. Pulling out her phone, Sarah activated the flashlight and directed the beam toward the sound. There, between two crumbling concrete pillars, lay a large German shepherd. The dog was on its side, its flanks rising and falling with labored breaths. Even from a distance, Sarah could see that the animal was female and heavily pregnant. Her coat was matted and dirty, and her eyes were half closed with exhaustion. "Oh, my God," Sarah whispered, instinctively taking a step back. She wasn't afraid of dogs, but finding one here, like this, it was unsettling. How had Ethan known? The rain was falling harder now, and water was beginning to pool more rapidly on the warehouse floor. The dog made another sound, this one weaker than before, and Ethan responded with an agitated wriggle. "We need to call someone," Sarah said, more to herself than to Ethan. She backed toward the entrance, intending to leave and make the call. From outside, when she heard voices, "Hello? Anybody in here?" A deep male voice echoed through the warehouse. "We heard a kid yelling," called another voice. "Everything okay?" Two men appeared at the entrance, silhouetted against the grey light outside. One was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a work jacket with Mike's Auto Repair embroidered on the pocket. The other was shorter, with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "In here," Sarah called, relief flooding through her. "There's a dog. I think she's dying." The men approached cautiously, their boots splashing in the puddles. When the taller man's flashlight fell on the German Shepherd, he let out a low whistle. "That's one pregnant dog," he said. "And in bad shape, too. I'm Mike, by the way. This is my brother, Ray. I'm Sarah. This is my son, Ethan." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. He somehow knew the dog was in here, started making noises like he was trying to bark. Mike and Ray exchanged puzzled glances, but didn't comment on this strange detail. Instead, Mike pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the fire department. They've got equipment to transport large animals. Ray, go to the shop and grab some blankets." Ray nodded and jogged back toward the entrance while Mike made the call. Sarah stood awkwardly beside Mike, holding Ethan close as the rain continued to pour through the leaking roof. "They'll be here in 5 minutes, Mike said, putting his phone away. "They said don't move her." He studied Sarah curiously. "Your boy really knew she was in here?" Sarah nodded, looking down at Ethan, who had calmed considerably now that help was on the way. His eyes remained fixed on the German Shepherd, who seemed to be looking back at him with equal intensity. "I've never seen anything like it," Sarah admitted. "We were just walking by, and he started acting strange, making these barking sounds. I've never heard him do that before." Before Mike could respond, Ray returned with 2 thick blankets and a first aid kit. "Thought this might help too," he said, setting the kit down beside the blankets. The next few minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the sound of rain on the metal roof and the occasional whimper from the dog. When they heard sirens approaching, Mike went to guide the firefighters in. 4 firefighters entered the warehouse, carrying equipment and a specially designed animal stretcher. They assessed the situation quickly, moving with practiced efficiency. "She's in rough shape," one of them said, a woman with a name tag reading Captain Martinez. "Dehydrated, malnourished, and about to give birth. We need to move her carefully." As they prepared to lift the dog onto the stretcher, the water on the warehouse floor began to rise more rapidly. One of the firefighters pointed to a drain in the corner that was clearly backed up, allowing rainwater to pool inside the building. "We need to hurry," he said. "This place is going to flood." Captain Martinez nodded, directing her team to secure the German Shepherd to the stretcher. As they lifted her, the dog's eyes found Ethan again, and something seemed to pass between them. Some silent understanding that made Sarah's skin prickle with goosebumps. "Where will you take her?" Sarah asked as they carried the stretcher toward the exit. "Millbrook Animal Hospital," Captain Martinez replied. "It's the closest place equipped for emergency veterinary care." Sarah nodded, clutching Ethan close as they followed the rescue team out of the warehouse. The rain had intensified into a downpour, and thunder rumbled overhead. By the time they reached the street, 2 police officers had arrived and were already placing caution tape around the warehouse entrance due to the flooding risk. "Will she be okay?" Sarah asked, raising her voice over the storm. Captain Martinez's expression was guarded. "Hard to say. She's in pretty bad condition, and with the puppies coming." She left the thought unfinished. As the firefighters loaded the stretcher into their emergency vehicle, Ethan began to cry, not his usual hungry or tired cry, but something deeper, more mournful. Sarah bounced him gently, trying to soothe him, but his eyes remained fixed on the departing truck until it turned a corner and disappeared from view. "You should get your boy home," Mike said, still standing beside her. You're both soaked. Thank you for helping, Sarah said, suddenly aware of how wet and cold she was. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. Mike smiled, rain dripping from his baseball cap. It was your boy who really helped that dog. Never seen anything like it. He hesitated, then added, If you want, I can drive you both to your place. No sense walking in this weather. Sarah looked at him uncertainly. Under normal circumstances, she would never accept a ride from a stranger, but there was something trustworthy about Mike, and the thought of walking another 6 blocks in the pouring rain with an increasingly fussy Ethan was not appealing. That would be... Thank you, she said, finally. As Mike led them toward his truck, Sarah couldn't shake the image of the German Shepherd's eyes, so tired, so pained, yet somehow filled with a desperate will to survive. And more disturbing was the connection she'd witnessed between the dog and her son, a connection she couldn't begin to understand. What had just happened? And why couldn't she shake the feeling that their lives had just changed irrevocably? Sarah couldn't sleep that night. Rain lashed against the windows of her small house as the storm intensified, and Ethan was unusually restless, waking every hour, with the same distressed cries he had made at the warehouse. By dawn, when the storm finally subsided, Sarah was exhausted, dark circles under her eyes as she prepared Ethan's breakfast. "What's going on with you, little man?" she murmured, watching him push away his favorite cereal. He kept looking toward the door and making those strange barking sounds again. Sarah's phone sat on the counter, and she glanced at it repeatedly, wondering if she should call the animal hospital. The thought seemed ridiculous. She had no connection to that dog beyond being present at its rescue. Yet Ethan's behavior made her uneasy, as if he somehow knew something she didn't. Finally, she picked up the phone. "This is probably crazy," she muttered to herself as she dialed the number for Millbrook Animal Hospital. A receptionist answered with a cheerful greeting. "Hi, I'm calling about the German Shepherd that was brought in yesterday," Sarah said, immediately feeling foolish. "The pregnant one from the warehouse?" "Oh yes," the receptionist's tone changed, becoming more serious. "Are you the owner?" "No, I was just there when she was found." Sarah hesitated. "My son, he's the one who noticed her. He's been upset since yesterday, and I just wondered how she was doing." There was a pause on the line. "Actually, Dr. Wilson might want to speak with you. Can you hold for a moment?" Before Sarah could respond, the line clicked and gentle hold music began to play. She paced the kitchen, watching Ethan, who had suddenly become alert, his eyes tracking her movements with the phone. "This is Dr. Wilson," a warm female voice came through the phone a minute later. "I understand you were present at the rescue yesterday." "Yes, my son and I were there," Sarah confirmed. "I'm Sarah Miller, and my son is Ethan." "Ms. Miller, I'm glad you called. The German Shepherd, we've been calling her Lady, had her puppies last night. It was touch and go for a while. She was severely malnourished and had an infection." Sarah's heart sank. Is she okay?" "She pulled through," Dr. Wilson said, "but we lost one of the puppies. The other 2 are small, but fighters. We're keeping them in intensive care." Relief flooded through Sarah, followed immediately by confusion about why she cared so much. "That's good news," she said. "Thank you for telling me." "There's something else," Dr. Wilson continued. "One of the firefighters mentioned something unusual about your son, that he somehow alerted you to the dog's presence." Sarah glanced at Ethan, who was now watching her intently. "Yes, it was strange. He started making noises like he was trying to bark, and he wouldn't stop until I checked the warehouse. I've never seen him do anything like that before." There was a long pause. "Ms. Miller, would it be possible for you and your son to come to the hospital today? There's something I'd like to show you." Sarah was taken aback by the request. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, everything's fine," Dr. Wilson assured her. "It's just, well, it's better if I show you in person." Curiosity overcame Sarah's hesitation. "We can be there in about an hour." After hanging up, Sarah quickly dressed Ethan and herself. The morning was clear and bright after the storm, the air washed clean. As they walked toward the bus stop, Sarah noticed that Ethan seemed energized, bouncing in his stroller and gesturing excitedly. The Millbrook Animal Hospital was a one-story brick building on the outskirts of town. When Sarah entered, pushing Ethan's stroller, the receptionist immediately recognized them. "Dr. Wilson is expecting you," she said, leading them down a hallway to a room at the back of the building. Dr. Wilson was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She greeted them warmly, her attention immediately focusing on Ethan. "This must be the little hero," she said, crouching down to Ethan's level. Ethan regarded her solemnly, then looked past her to the door of an adjacent room. "He seems to know where he wants to go," Dr. Wilson said with a smile, standing up. "That's what I wanted to show you. Follow me." She led them into a quiet room where the German Shepherd lay on a padded bed. Two tiny puppies nestled against her. A monitor beeped steadily beside her, and IV lines ran into her foreleg. Despite her obvious weakness, the dog's head lifted immediately when they entered. What happened next left Sarah speechless. Ethan let out a sound of pure joy, reaching his arms toward the dog. And Lady, despite her condition, wagged her tail weakly, her eyes fixed on Ethan with what could only be described as recognition. "This is what's been happening all morning," Dr. Wilson said quietly. "Every time we mention the little boy who found her, she reacts. When the puppies were born, she seemed to be looking for something, or someone. I've never seen anything quite like it." Sarah stared at the scene before her, unable to process what she was witnessing. "I don't understand. How could they have a connection? They only saw each other for a few minutes yesterday." Dr. Wilson shook her head. "I don't have a scientific explanation for you, but I've been a veterinarian for 30 years, and I've learned that there are some things science hasn't caught up to yet." Ethan was straining against his stroller, straps now, clearly wanting to get closer to Lady. Sarah hesitated, looking at Dr. Wilson. "It's okay," the veterinarian assured her. "Lady is very gentle. She was someone's pet once. She has the remnants of a collar mark on her neck, though no actual collar or microchip." Carefully, Sarah unfastened Ethan and lifted him from the stroller. She approached Lady slowly, ready to pull back at the first sign of aggression. But the dog only watched them with those intelligent eyes, her tail continuing its weak but steady wag. When they were close enough, Sarah knelt and let Ethan sit on the floor beside Lady's bed. Immediately, the dog stretched her neck to sniff Ethan's hand, then gently licked it. Ethan giggled, a sound of such pure delight that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "I've never seen him connect with anyone like this," she admitted. "He's usually shy around strangers." "Animals can sense things we can't," Dr. Wilson said, watching the interaction with fascination. "And children, especially very young ones, are more tuned into those senses than adults." A soft whimpering drew their attention to the puppies, who were beginning to stir. One was black and tan like Lady, while the other was almost entirely black with just a small white patch on its chest. "They're beautiful," Sarah said, watching as Lady nuzzled. "Her puppies," Dr. Wilson nodded. "They'll be beautiful dogs if they make it. The next 48 hours are critical." Ethan reached out tentatively toward the puppies, but Sarah caught his hand. "No, sweetie, they're too little to touch right now." "Actually," Dr. Wilson interjected, "there's something called kangaroo care that's beneficial for struggling newborns, human or animal. Gentle contact can help regulate their body temperature and heartbeat." She looked thoughtfully at Ethan. "Given the connection he seems to have, it might help." Under Dr. Wilson's careful supervision, Sarah guided Ethan's hand to gently stroke the larger of the two puppies. The tiny creature squirmed at first, then settled under his touch, seeming to draw comfort from the contact. "Amazing," Dr. Wilson murmured, checking the puppy's vitals on a small handheld monitor. "His heart rate is stabilizing." They stayed. For nearly an hour, Ethan sitting contentedly beside Lady, occasionally stroking her or the puppies under Sarah's watchful eye. When it was finally time to leave, Ethan protested vigorously, and Lady whined as they moved toward the door. "Can we come back tomorrow?" Sarah asked, surprised by her own question. Dr. Wilson smiled. "I think that would be very beneficial for Lady and the puppies, and perhaps for Ethan too." As they walked out of the animal hospital, Sarah felt strangely lighter, despite the confusion swirling in her mind. She had no explanation for the bond between her son and the German Shepherd, but she couldn't deny its existence. "We'll come back tomorrow," she promised Ethan as they waited at the bus stop. The bus ride home was quiet, Ethan dozing against her shoulder, worn out from the emotional morning. Sarah gazed out the window, barely noticing the familiar streets of Millbrook passing by. Her thoughts were interrupted when the bus stopped near Mike's auto repair. Standing outside the garage was Mike, the man who had helped them yesterday. He looked up as the bus passed, and their eyes met briefly. Sarah gave a small, awkward wave, which he returned with a surprised smile. As the bus continued on, Sarah found herself thinking about how quickly life could change. Yesterday, she had been focused solely on surviving another day as a struggling, single mother. Today, she was caught up in something she couldn't explain, a mysterious connection between her son and a rescued dog. Back at home, Sarah settled Ethan for his nap, then sat at her small kitchen table with her laptop. Her nursing textbooks gathered dust on a nearby shelf, reminders of the future she had once envisioned for herself. On impulse, she opened her browser and began to search for information about children with special connections to animals. Most of what she found was anecdotal, stories of children who seemed to have unique bonds with certain animals or who demonstrated unusual abilities to calm or communicate with them. Nothing scientific, nothing that explained what she had witnessed today. As evening fell, Sarah checked her bank account online, calculating how much she could spare for bus fare to the animal hospital over the next few days. The numbers were discouraging. Her part-time job at the local diner barely covered rent and groceries. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Hi, Sarah. It's Mike from yesterday. The fire captain gave me your number. Just checking to see if you heard anything about the dog." Sarah stared at the message, surprised by how pleased she felt to hear from him. She typed back, "Yes, she had her puppies last night. 2 survived. Ethan and I visited them today." Mike's response came quickly. "That's great news. If you need a ride to visit them again, let me know. No charge." Sarah hesitated, her finger hovering over the keyboard. She rarely accepted help from anyone, her pride still smarting from being abandoned by James when she needed him most. But there was something sincere about Mike's offer. "Thanks," she finally replied. "Maybe tomorrow afternoon." As she put her phone down, she heard Ethan stir in his crib. Walking to his room, she found him sitting up, fully awake and making the barking sounds again. "What is it, little man?" she asked, lifting him into her arms. Ethan pointed toward the window, toward the direction of the animal hospital, his expression serious and intent. "I know," Sarah said softly. "I miss them too. We'll go back tomorrow." Outside, the last light of day faded from the sky and stars began to appear. Sarah stood at the window with Ethan in her arms, both of them looking out at the night, connected now to something neither of them fully understood, but which had irrevocably changed the course of their lives. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah and Ethan fell into a new routine. Every afternoon, Mike would pick them up in his truck and drive them to the animal hospital. Dr. Wilson had given them special permission to visit outside normal hours, intrigued by the unusual bond between Ethan and Lady. Lady's health improved steadily, and the puppies, now named Shadow and Scout, grew stronger each day. Ethan would sit beside Lady's bed, sometimes reading to her from his picture books, sometimes just resting his small hand on her flank while she dozed. The staff had begun referring to Ethan as the Dog Whisperer, a nickname that made Sarah both proud and uneasy. On this particular afternoon, as they entered the animal hospital, they were greeted not by the usual receptionist, but by an elegant woman in her 60s with short silver hair and designer glasses. "You must be Sarah and Ethan," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Pierce, the hospital director. Dr. Wilson has told me so much about you both." Sarah shook the woman's hand, noting her firm grip and direct gaze. "Nice to meet you." "Dr. Wilson is finishing up a surgery," Dr. Pierce explained, leading them down the hallway. "She asked if I would take you to see Lady and the puppies. I must admit, I've been curious to witness this connection for myself." When they entered Lady's room, the German Shepherd immediately perked up, her tail thumping against the bedding. The puppies, now mobile enough to squirm around their mother, made squeaking sounds as if in greeting. Dr. Pierce watched with undisguised fascination as Ethan approached Lady, the dog licking his face while he giggled with delight. "Remarkable," she murmured. Dr. Wilson wasn't exaggerating. Sarah nodded, having grown somewhat accustomed to the sight. "It's been like this since the first day." "May I ask you something, Ms. Miller?" Dr. Pierce said, her gaze still fixed on Ethan and Lady. "Has your son always had this affinity with animals?" Sarah considered the question. "I don't really know. We've never had pets, and we don't encounter many animals in our neighborhood." She hesitated, then added, "But the way he knew Lady was in that warehouse, it was like he could hear something I couldn't." Dr. Pierce nodded thoughtfully. "I've been a veterinarian for over 40 years, and I've seen a few cases like this, children with an unusual ability to connect with animals. Most grow out of it as they get older and more socialized to human ways of communicating." "So you think it's something he'll lose?" Sarah asked, surprised by the pang of sadness she felt at the thought. "Not necessarily lose," Dr. Pierce clarified, "but the connection often becomes less immediate, less intuitive." She adjusted her glasses. "That's actually why I wanted to meet you both. I'd like to propose something." At that moment, Dr. Wilson entered the room, still wearing her surgical cap. "I see you've met Dr. Pierce," she said with a smile. "Has she told you about her idea yet?" "I was just about to," Dr. Pierce said. She turned back to Sarah. "Lady and her puppies will be ready for adoption soon. Normally, we would put them into our regular adoption program, but given the special circumstances..." She glanced at Ethan, who was now lying on the floor beside Lady, the puppies climbing over his legs. "I believe Lady should go home with you and Ethan." Sarah stared at the woman in shock. I don't think we can," she stammered. "My apartment doesn't allow pets, and I can barely afford to feed myself and Ethan, let alone a large dog. And puppies." Dr. Pierce held up a hand. "Let me finish. I recently inherited a property from my brother, a small house on the edge of town with a fenced yard. It's been sitting empty for months while I decide what to do with it. I'm considering turning it into a kind of halfway house for our special needs animals, those who need extra care before adoption." She paused, looking Sarah directly in the eyes. "I need someone to live there to provide that care. The position includes housing, a stipend, and all animal expenses covered. Dr. Wilson mentioned that you have some nursing training?" Sarah nodded, stunned. "I completed most of my RN program before I had to drop out." "Perfect. The job would involve basic medical care for the animals, record keeping, and coordinating with our staff veterinarians." Dr. Pierce glanced at Ethan. "And your son's special connection could be invaluable." Sarah's mind raced. It sounded too good to be true. A solution to her housing problems, a job that used her medical training, and a way to keep Ethan connected to Lady. But years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious. "This is very generous," she said slowly. "But why me? You barely know me." Dr. Wilson stepped forward. "It was my recommendation, Sarah. I've watched you with Lady and the puppies these past 2 weeks. You have a natural way with them, and your medical background is exactly what we need." She smiled. "Plus, I've never seen an animal respond to a child the way Lady responds to Ethan. There's something special there, something worth nurturing." Sarah looked at Ethan, who was completely absorbed in playing with the puppies, his face alight with joy. When was the last time she had seen him so happy? Before she could respond, there was a knock on the door. Mike stood in the doorway, his work cap in his hands. "Sorry to interrupt. The receptionist said I could come back here." "Mike," Sarah said, surprised to see him inside rather than waiting in the parking lot as usual. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," he assured her. "I just finished early at the shop and thought I'd come in to see how Lady and the pups are doing." He nodded politely to the 2 veterinarians. "I hope that's all right." "Of course," Dr. Wilson said. "You were part of the rescue team after all." Mike crouched down beside Ethan, who greeted him with a happy babble. Over the past 2 weeks, Ethan had warmed to Mike, often raising his arms to be lifted into the truck for their daily rides. "They've grown," Mike observed, gently stroking Scout's tiny head. "You'd never know they were fighting for their lives a couple weeks ago." Dr. Pierce watched the interaction with interest. "You're the mechanic who helped with the rescue?" Mike nodded. "Mike Davison. My shop's about a mile from where we found Lady." "Mr. Davison, can I ask, how is the warehouse where Lady was found? Is it still flooded?" Mike looked surprised by the question. "No, the water receded after a day or so. Why do you ask?" Dr. Pierce and Dr. Wilson exchanged a glance. "We've been trying to piece together Lady's history," Dr. Wilson explained. "She had a faded tattoo in her ear that suggests she came from a breeding program, but we've been unable to trace it back to any registered breeder. We were wondering if there might be clues in the warehouse," Dr. Pierce added, "something to help us understand how she ended up there." Mike scratched his chin thoughtfully. "I could take a look. The place has been abandoned for years. It used to be part of the old ironworks complex. City's been trying to sell the land for redevelopment, but no takers so far." "That would be helpful," Dr. Pierce said. She turned back to Sarah. "About my offer, you don't need to decide immediately. Why don't you come see the house tomorrow? Bring Ethan, of course." Sarah nodded, still overwhelmed by the unexpected proposal. "Thank you, I'd like that." After making arrangements to meet Dr. Pierce the following day, Sarah collected Ethan, who protested loudly at being separated from Lady and the puppies. Mike carried him to the truck, distracting him with a small toy dashboard he kept in the mall. "A glove compartment specially for Ethan. Sounds like quite an opportunity," Mike said, as they drove back to Sarah's apartment. "A house, a job, and a dog for the little man." Sarah gazed out the window, her thoughts in turmoil. "It does sound perfect. Maybe too perfect." Mike glanced at her. "You don't trust it?" "I've learned to be careful about things that seem too good to be true," Sarah replied, thinking of James and his promises. Mike was quiet for a moment. "I've known Dr. Wilson for years. She treated my sister's cat when it got hit by a car, even though we couldn't afford the full treatment. She's good people." He paused. "And I could check out the house for you if you want. Make sure everything's safe, up to code." Sarah looked at him, surprised by the offer. "You'd do that?" Mike shrugged, his eyes on the road. "Sure. It's what neighbors do, right?" The casual kindness in his voice made Sarah's throat tighten unexpectedly. How long had it been since someone had simply offered to help her without expecting anything in return? "Thank you," she said softly. "I'd appreciate that." When they reached her apartment, Mike insisted on carrying a now sleeping Ethan inside. Sarah unlocked the door, acutely aware of the peeling paint, the second-hand furniture, the general shabbiness of the place she called home. "Sorry about the mess," she said automatically as Mike laid Ethan gently on his small bed. Mike straightened up, his expression serious. "Sarah, can I say something?" She nodded, suddenly nervous. "You're doing an amazing job with Ethan. Being a single parent isn't easy. My sister raised my nephew alone, so I've seen how hard it can be." He glanced around the apartment. "Don't be too proud to accept help when it's offered, especially when it's good for both of you." Sarah looked away, fighting unexpected tears. "I'm trying," she whispered. Mike moved toward the door. "I'll pick you up tomorrow for the house viewing. Around 10, okay?" Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. After Mike left, she sat on the edge of her bed, her emotions a confusing mix of hope, fear, and something else. Something she wasn't ready to name that had to do with the kind mechanic who had become a fixture in their lives over the past 2 weeks. Later that night, after putting Ethan to bed, Sarah opened her laptop and typed Millbrook Ironworks history into the search engine. Most of the results were about the town's industrial past, but one link caught her eye. Millbrook Ironworks Complex hides dark secret. The article, from a local history blog, described rumors that part of the ironworks complex had been used for secretive government experiments in the 1960s involving animal behavioral studies. The program had allegedly been shut down after public outcry over ethical concerns, but according to local legend, some of the research had continued underground. Sarah was about to dismiss it as conspiracy theories when she noticed a grainy black and white photograph accompanying the article. It showed a section of the complex with a sign that read, "Millbrook Advanced Research Division, authorized personnel only." And in the foreground, barely visible, was a kennel with several German shepherds. She stared at the image, a chill running down her spine. Could there be a connection to Lady? It seemed far-fetched. The photo was from decades ago, and Lady was only a few years old. But still, the coincidence was unsettling. Sarah closed her laptop, deciding not to mention the article to Dr. Wilson or Dr. Pierce just yet. Tomorrow, she would see the house and make a decision about her future. But tonight, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Lady's story than a simple case of abandonment, and that somehow, for reasons she couldn't begin to understand, her son was connected to it all. Outside her window, the moon rose over Millbrook, casting silver light on the abandoned industrial district. In the distance, the old ironworks loomed like a skeleton of the past, its secrets hidden in shadows and rust. The house stood at the end of a quiet street on the eastern edge of Millbrook, where the town gradually gave way to rolling countryside. It was a modest 2-story craftsman with a wide front porch and a red brick chimney. The paint was faded in places, and the garden had grown wild. But to Sarah, who had spent the last 2 years in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment, it looked like something from a dream. "It needs some work," Dr. Pierce admitted as she unlocked the front door. "My brother wasn't much for home maintenance, but the structure is sound, and there's plenty of space for you, Ethan, and the animals." Sarah stepped inside, taking in the worn, hardwood floors, the built-in bookshelves flanking a stone fireplace, and the large windows that filled the space with morning light. Ethan, who had been unusually quiet during the drive, suddenly became animated, toddling from room to room with excited babbles. "He approves," Mike said with a smile. He had kept his promise to accompany them, and now walked through the space with a professional eye, checking baseboards and tapping walls. The tour continued through a spacious kitchen with outdated but functional appliances, a small bathroom, and a sunroom that opened onto a large, fenced backyard. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms and another bathroom. "The smallest bedroom we've set up as an office," Dr. Pierce explained, showing them a room with a desk, filing cabinets, and medical supplies. This is where you'd keep records and do any necessary treatments for the animals in your care. In the backyard, a detached garage had been converted into a heated kennel area with several large enclosures. For the animals that need more space, or separation, Dr. Pierce said, and of course, we'll provide all the equipment and supplies you need. As Dr. Pierce outlined the responsibilities of the position, daily care for up to 6 animals, coordination with the hospital for more, complex medical needs, record-keeping, and periodic home visits for potential adopters, Sarah felt a growing sense that this was right. This could be the fresh start she and Ethan needed. "What do you think?" Dr. Pierce asked when the tour was complete. They stood in the living room, where Ethan was crawling beneath the bay window, seemingly searching for something. Before Sarah could respond, Ethan let out a high-pitched sound, the same one he had made when finding Lady in the warehouse. He pointed insistently at a small door in the wall beneath the window. "What is it, sweetie?" Sarah asked, moving to his side. Dr. Pierce looked puzzled. "That's just an access panel for the plumbing. I don't think it's been opened in years." Mike crouched beside Ethan, examining the small door. "It does look a bit newer than the surrounding woodwork," he observed. "Mind if I take a look?" Dr. Pierce nodded, and Mike pulled a small multi-tool from his pocket. He worked at the edges of the panel until it popped open with a creak of protest. Inside was a small cavity, and nestled within it was a worn leather collar, the metal tags green with age. Mike carefully extracted it and handed it to Dr. Pierce. "Good heavens," she murmured, studying the collar. "This is military issue, from the K-9 units they trained at the old base outside town, but that closed in the 70s. Sarah remembered the article she had read the previous night. "Dr. Pierce, was there ever any connection between the military base and the Millbrook Ironworks?" Dr. Pierce looked up sharply. "Why do you ask?" "I found an article online about some kind of research program at the Ironworks," Sarah explained. "Something about animal behavior studies in the 60s. A shadow passed over Dr. Pierce's face. "That program was called Project Sentinel. My father worked on it as a young veterinarian." She turned the collar over in her hands. "He never spoke much about it, said it was all classified, but I gathered they were trying to develop dogs with enhanced abilities for military applications." "Enhanced abilities," Sarah repeated, glancing at Ethan, who was still staring at the collar. "Improved scent detection, heightened alertness, that sort of thing," Dr. Pierce said. "But rumors suggested they were aiming for something more unusual, psychic connections between handlers and dogs, extrasensory perception, that kind of thing." Mike let out a low whistle. "Sounds like science fiction." "Most of it probably was," Dr. Pierce agreed. "The program was officially shut down in 1968 after a congressional investigation into ethical concerns. But local rumors persisted that some aspect of it continued underground." She shook her head. "I never put much stock in those stories, but finding this here..." "Do you think Lady could be connected to that program somehow?" Sarah asked. "She does have that tattoo in her ear." Dr. Pierce examined the collar's tag, which bore a faded serial number and the letters MARD, Millbrook Advanced Research Division. "It's possible, but the timeline doesn't work. This collar is decades old, and Lady is only a few years old." "Could she be a descendant?" Mike suggested. "From the same breeding line?" Dr. Pierce's eyes widened. "That might actually be possible. Some of those German Shepherd lines were quite distinctive. If someone continued the breeding program privately..." She trailed off, lost in thought. Ethan had grown increasingly agitated, reaching for the collar and making the barking sounds that had become familiar to Sarah over the past weeks. "He wants the collar," Sarah said. Dr. Pierce hesitated, then handed it to Sarah. "It's technically part of the house, which is now hospital property, but given everything that's happened, perhaps Ethan should have it." Sarah gave the collar to Ethan, who immediately calmed, clutching it to his chest. The room fell silent as they all watched the little boy, each lost in their own thoughts about what this might mean. "Well," Dr. Pierce said finally, "this has been an unexpected development, but it doesn't change my offer, Sarah. If anything, it makes me more certain that you and Ethan are meant to be here." Sarah looked around. The house, once more, at the solid walls that would shelter them, the yard where Ethan could play safely, the space that could become a real home. Whatever mysteries surrounded Lady and the old research program, this opportunity was too important to pass up. "We'll take it," she said, her voice firm despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "When can we move in?" "The sooner the better," Dr. Pierce replied with a smile. "The house has been empty too long, and Lady and her puppies are ready to leave the hospital. Would next week work for you?" Sarah nodded, a surge of excitement, pushing aside her lingering concerns. Next week would be perfect. Mike gave her a thumbs up from across the room, his pride in her decision evident in his grin. As they prepared to leave, Sarah couldn't resist asking one more question. "Dr. Pierce, what happened to the dogs from the research program after it was shut down?" Dr. Pierce paused at the front door. "According to my father, most were adopted by their handlers, but a few, the ones that showed the most unusual abilities, were kept for further study." She glanced at Ethan, who was still clutching the old collar. "My father always said those dogs had a special light in their eyes, like they understood more than they should." "Like Lady," Sarah murmured. "Yes," Dr. Pierce agreed quietly. "Very much like Lady." The following week passed in a blur of activity. Sarah gave notice at her apartment and her job at the diner, packed their meager belongings, and spent hours on the phone with Dr. Wilson, learning about the specific needs of the animals that would be in her care. Mike proved invaluable, volunteering his truck and his time to help with the move. He also recruited his brother Ray and two friends from the auto shop to repaint Ethan's bedroom and repair some loose floorboards in the kitchen. "You don't have to do all this," Sarah protested when she saw the four men installing a new ceiling fan in the living room. Mike shrugged. "Call it a housewarming present. Besides, Ray's wife is threatening to redecorate their whole house, so he's hiding out here as long as possible." On moving day, Sarah was surprised to find Dr. Wilson and 3 veterinary technicians waiting at the house when they arrived. "We brought a welcome committee," Dr. Wilson explained, opening the back doors of the animal hospital's van. Lady emerged first, still thin but much healthier than when they had found her. She wore a new blue collar and moved with more confidence. When she saw Ethan, she bounded forward, covering his face with enthusiastic licks while he squealed with delight. The puppies followed, now the size of small cats, tumbling over each other in their excitement to explore their new surroundings. "They remember the house," Dr. Wilson observed as the puppies made a beeline for the backyard. "They were never here before, but they're acting like they know exactly where they're going." Sarah watched Lady guide Ethan around the yard, noticing how the dog positioned herself between the child and any potential hazards. The connection between them had only grown stronger during their hospital visits, and now, seeing them together in what would be their home, she felt a sense of rightness that pushed away her lingering doubts. By evening, the helpers had departed, leaving Sarah and Ethan alone in their new home with Lady and the puppies. As darkness fell, Sarah sat on the porch swing, watching the fireflies emerge in the yard. Ethan played on a blanket at her feet, with Lady lying protectively beside him, and the puppies dozing in a pile nearby. "We did it, little man," she said softly. "This is our home now." Ethan looked up at her, his face serious in the gathering dusk. Then he pointed toward the old ironworks, just visible as a dark silhouette against the horizon. "Baba," he said clearly, his attempt at bad. It was a word Sarah had been trying to teach him, usually in reference to hot stoves or sharp objects. Sarah felt a chill despite the warm evening. "What's bad, sweetie?" Ethan just continued pointing, his expression solemn. Lady had risen to her feet, her attention focused in the same direction, a low growl rumbling in her throat. Before Sarah could process this strange behavior, her phone rang. It was Mike, checking to make sure they were settling in. Sarah described the odd moment with Ethan and Lady. "Kids pick up on all kinds of things," Mike said reassuringly, "and dogs can hear sounds we can't. Probably just a raccoon or something." But his tone lacked conviction. After hanging up, Sarah brought Ethan inside for his bath and bedtime routine, as she tucked him into his new bed, surrounded by the freshly painted walls in a cheerful blue. She couldn't shake the memory of his serious little face as he pointed toward the ironworks. Later, unable to sleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, searching for more information about Project Sentinel. Most results were the same conspiracy theories and rumors she had found before, but one new link caught her attention. An obituary for a Dr. Harrison Wells, described as a pioneering researcher in animal cognition and interspecies communication. The obituary mentioned his work at the Millbrook Research Facility in the 1960s, followed by a long career at a private research institution called the Barton Institute. What caught Sarah's attention was the date of his passing. Just 3 months ago. More importantly, the obituary mentioned that Dr. Wells was survived by his son, Thomas Wells, who resided in Millbrook. Sarah quickly searched for this name and found that Thomas Wells was a real estate developer, the same developer who had been trying to purchase the old ironworks property for redevelopment. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. Could this be mere coincidence? Or was there some connection between the old research program, Lady's appearance at the warehouse, and this developer's interest in the property? She was still pondering these questions when a sound from outside caught her attention. Looking through the kitchen window, she saw Lady standing rigid in the backyard, staring toward the ironworks again. The dog's posture was alert, her ears forward, as if listening to something Sarah couldn't hear. For a long moment, they both remained still, Sarah watching from the window, Lady watching something unseen in the distance. Then the German Shepherd turned and trotted back to the house, pausing at the door to look back once more before scratching to be let in. When Sarah opened the door, Lady immediately went to Ethan's room, settling herself on the rug beside his bed as if standing guard. The puppies, sensing their mother's vigilance, huddled close to her instead of playing as they usually did. Sarah checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked before returning to her own room. As she lay in bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled into something larger than a simple case of an abandoned dog. Something connected to Millbrook's past, to the old research facility, and somehow to her son's unexplainable bond with Lady. Outside, the night grew deeper. In Ethan's room, Lady remained awake, her eyes fixed on the window, her ears tuned to sounds beyond human hearing. And miles away, at the abandoned ironworks, lights moved in windows that had been dark for decades. Autumn settled over Millbrook, painting the trees in fiery hues and bringing a crisp chill to the morning air. 3 months had passed since Sarah and Ethan had moved into the house at the edge of town, and their lives had transformed in ways Sarah could never have imagined. The animal halfway house was thriving. Under Sarah's care, a dozen rescued animals had recovered and found permanent homes. Lady and her puppies had become local celebrities. Scout had been adopted by the Hendersons, whose autistic daughter had begun speaking in full sentences after the puppy's arrival. Shadow went to an elderly widower named Mr. Collins, who claimed the dog had alerted him to a gas leak in his home, potentially saving his life. The most remarkable changes, however, were in Ethan. At 2 years old, his vocabulary had exploded, and his connection with animals had only grown stronger. When Sarah brought home a rescued cat with a broken leg, Ethan had immediately gone to the wounded limb and placed his hand on it. The cat, which had hissed at everyone else, had grown calm under his touch, and its fracture began healing far more rapidly than expected. On a bright October morning, Sarah stood on the front porch, watching Ethan and Lady play in the yard. Her reflections were interrupted by the sound of a car approaching, an expensive black SUV that slowed to a stop in front of the house. A man in his early 50s emerged, dressed in a tailored suit. "Ms. Miller, I'm Thomas Wells." He extended a manicured hand. "I believe Dr. Pierce may have mentioned me." Before Sarah could respond, Lady had positioned herself at Sarah's side, her posture rigid, a low growl emanating from her throat. Ethan had followed, clutching the leg of Sarah's jeans and staring at the man with unusual intensity. "Ah, this must be the famous Lady," Wells said, his gaze shifting to the German Shepherd. "And the boy who found her. Remarkable story." Wells revealed that he was the son of Dr. Harrison Wells, the lead scientist of Project Sentinel, a government program that had conducted research on enhanced communication between certain dogs and humans decades ago at the Millbrook Ironworks. "I'll be blunt, Ms. Miller. That dog belongs to me," Wells stated coldly. "She was part of a private breeding program based on my father's research, a program that cost millions to develop. She escaped during transport 3 months ago, and I've been searching for her ever since." His gaze shifted to Ethan. "I'd be very interested in speaking with Dr. Pierce about your son's unusual abilities. My father's research wasn't just about the animals. It was about the connection between certain people and animals, a neurological compatibility that allows for enhanced communication. Your son would make a fascinating case study. I think you should leave," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. After Wells departed, Sarah immediately called Dr. Pierce, who arrived with her lawyer. Mike soon joined them, and Sarah's kitchen became an impromptu war council. "Wells's claim is tenuous at best," the lawyer explained. "Even if he can prove Lady came from his breeding program, he abandoned her when she escaped. Under Pennsylvania law, that constitutes forfeiture of ownership." Dr. Pierce revealed that Project Sentinel had been searching for people with enhanced empathic abilities, particularly children, who could form special bonds with certain bloodlines of dogs. "Ethan's connection with Lady isn't random chance," she explained. "It's the result of complementary genetic traits." Mike had discovered that Wells was planning to rebuild his father's research facility at the Ironworks site, including a residential educational facility for specially gifted children like Ethan. 2 weeks of legal battles followed. Then, just as they received news that one of Wells's former employees had come forward with evidence that Lady had been deliberately abandoned, Wells himself arrived at the house in a rage. "Pierce!" he shouted at Dr. Pierce, "call off your lawyers. You have no idea what you're interfering with." "I know exactly what I'm interfering with," Dr. Pierce replied calmly. "Your father's research should have stayed buried. What he did to those animals, to those children, was unconscionable." To everyone's surprise, Ethan stepped forward, Lady at his side. "Her name is Lady," he said clearly to Wells, "not subject." His vocabulary and articulation were startling for a child his age. Wells stared at the child, then laughed harshly. "You see, even his linguistic development is accelerated by the bond. My father was right about everything." Before Wells could approach Ethan, police cruisers arrived. Dr. Pierce had filed a restraining order that morning, and Wells was in violation of it. As the police escorted Wells away, he looked defeated. "You don't understand what you're throwing away," he said quietly. "The potential, the possibilities." "Some possibilities should remain unexplored," Dr. Pierce replied. "Your father learned that too late. I had hoped you would be wiser." Later that evening, after Ethan was asleep and Dr. Pierce had gone home, Sarah and Mike sat at the kitchen table discussing the future. "Do you think Ethan will always have this ability?" Mike asked, watching. As Lady lay at the foot of the stairs, her eyes fixed on Ethan's bedroom door. "I don't know," Sarah replied. "Dr. Pierce said most children with these sensitivities lose them as they get older. But then, Ethan has never been a conventional child." "And you're not a conventional mother," Mike said warmly. "The way you've protected him, supported him. Not many people would have embraced a gift like his." Their conversation was interrupted when Ethan appeared in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "What is it, sweetie?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside him. Ethan shook his head. "Lady happy," he said simply. "Family." Sarah glanced at Lady, who had risen to press against Ethan's side, her tail wagging gently. Then she looked at Mike, who was watching them with an expression that made her heart skip. "Yes," she said softly, including all of them in her gaze. "Family." As she tucked Ethan back into bed, with Lady settling on the rug beside him, Sarah reflected on their journey. 3 months ago, she had been a struggling single mother with few prospects. Now she had a home, a purpose, and a growing circle of people and animals who cared for her and Ethan, all because her extraordinary child had heard a silent call that no one else could hear. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Sarah, Ethan, and Lady has touched your hearts. Their extraordinary connection reminds us that some bonds transcend explanation and that the most powerful forms of communication don't always require words. If you enjoyed this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories that explore the mysterious connections between humans and animals. Find it by clicking to your left. If this tale of a mother's love, a child's special gift, and a dog's unwavering loyalty moved you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore life's complexities and the remarkable bonds we share with all living beings. What special connection have you experienced with an animal in your life? We'd love to hear your own extraordinary stories in the comments below. Until our next adventure together, remember that sometimes the most important calls we receive are the ones that can't be heard, only felt.